First, we're going to start off. If you can tell us what was your inspiration for developing a film that talks about the effects of climate change in different native societies.
Sure. In 2008, I made a documentary called The Linguists, and it followed David and Greg, two linguists, who were documenting endangered languages. And we followed them to far-off places like Siberia and Bolivia and India to find languages that were on the verge of extinction. And what the film looks at is how when a language dies, so does a piece of culture, so does the things that are encoded in a language, whether it's knowledge, whether it's traditions, whether it's customs. And I found the topic really fascinating, and the film was very successful. It was at a major film festival in America called Sundance, and it aired on PBS, which is public television. It was nominated for an Emmy Award. And my partners and I decided that we wanted to make another film that also looked at science, social science, and examined how culture is disappearing. And we came across Susie Crate, who's the anthropologist in my latest film, and her expertise was studying how climate change impacted people, indigenous people, and it felt like a good story again. It examines how culture is disappearing in a very different way, whereas language is being lost as a result of economics and shifting, geopolitics. The culture is being lost because the weather is changing, and people who depend on the land are no longer able to depend on the land, so they have to move or adapt or change. And that's how I became interested in climate change as a topic. It wasn't something I thought about before making this film, and over the 6 years it took to make the film, it became something all I could think about.
Why is it important to understand the way climate change affects us all, as well as the indigenous community?
Right. So what's important about indigenous communities is that they are on the front lines of what is changing and happening to the planet. So if you go to an indigenous community in, let's say, Peru, where they are farming by the glaciers, and all of a sudden they can't plant the same plants and crops at the altitudes that they're planting because there's no water anymore, so they have to move to a higher altitude, then you see that here's people who have been doing something the same way for a long time. They depend on the sustenance of the crops they're growing. The other people around them depend on the crops that they're growing. And now all of a sudden, things have changed. Why is that important to us in these Western, civilization and countries where we go to the supermarket and buy food? Because they are on the front lines. What's happening for the indigenous people is happening soon to us and to places around the world that we'll see happen very quickly soon. I think the film is not for people who don't believe in climate change. The film is for people who already understand that climate change exists. And it asks the question, how do you adapt and change to the changing planet, knowing that the planet is changing? The temperatures are rising. The oceans are getting higher. The glaciers are melting. These are all facts. And the film is for smart people who understand facts. It'd be like me saying, I'm going to make a film about whether gravity exists or not. If I drop this microphone, we know gravity exists. So I think for me, climate change became a topic that I didn't think too much about. But when experiencing and traveling to these places and seeing how it was impacting these other people, these indigenous people, it became very close to my heart. I'm going to start paying attention to how things change where I live.
So, due to this, working with Margaret Mead and Susan Crate, change your perspective on the way climate change affects us today?
So Margaret Mead has passed away, and in the film is her daughter, Mary Catherine Bateson, who also was an anthropologist. And your question is, did working with Mary Catherine Bateson and Susie Crate, the two anthropologists in my film, change how I thought about climate change? Yeah, most certainly. Like Susie has spent her life studying people. That's what an anthropologist does. And coming to the conclusions based on the accounts of people. Like a lot of these social sciences involve listening. So you go into a village and you talk to the people who live there and you say, what's different now from, when you were a child? What do you notice? Well, the lake used to be much smaller, or there was a lot less mosquitoes, or whatever the things that they notice, and then you're marking that down, and you're sort of paying attention to how things are changing. And the same is true in, like, say, a fishing village in the United States, where they're fishing for oysters or eel or whatever they catch, crabs that they send to the city for the supermarkets. They notice that certain fish aren't coming around anymore, or that chunks of ice used to float in the Chesapeake Bay that no longer are there. So what I learned was to pay attention and to talk to people, to understand how things are changing, because the best source of what's happening in the world is people, because we all notice what's around us and what changes.
Now it's more like not from the film.
Okay.
Has it always been your dream to become a movie producer and director?
A producer, probably not, because I probably didn't know what that means. A lot of people don't still know what that means. But since I was a small child, I always wanted to make films. And I remember back when I was a little kid, we were shooting on VHS tapes. You would put the VHS tape in the camera and close the camera, and you'd walk around. And me and my friends, when we were in junior high school, used to walk around with the camera and make short, silly films. And then when I got older in high school, it became a little bit more serious. We made, films with an important message and little mini documentaries, really. And I'm, I guess, a rare example of someone who knew what they wanted to do when they were little and was able to do it. And I feel lucky because a lot of people want to make films, and I feel lucky that my films are actually being seen, because it's very difficult to get your films seen. So
in high school, what were your films about?
One of them was really ridiculous. It was about abortion. My friends and I had heard that there was an abortion clinic in our town, and we wanted to visit it with our camera and talk to the people that ran it. And when we got there, it wasn't an abortion clinic. It was a right to life information clinic for women to come to be convinced not to get abortions. So that was my first documentary, which involved no research and was like a fiasco. But you learn from your mistakes. And I think an early film I saw, Roger and Me is the name of the film, by Michael Moore, who's a very well-known filmmaker in the States. Maybe even here you've heard of his films, Bowling for Columbine or Fahrenheit, I think was one of his. But Roger and Me was a film about how the GM Motor Company was causing poverty in Detroit by moving their plants out, and that people were being evicted from their homes, and it was just destroying the economy. And it really spoke to me because he did it in a way that was very funny, and it was very moving, and you saw good and bad on screen. And that was inspiring when I was young. It said, you can use film to actually get a message across. And I think that's where my early inspiration came from.
And what led you to the path of documentary making?
So when I was in college, I was convinced I was going to make not documentaries, but narratives. Those are what we call movies, like you'd see in the theater with a story. And I got out of college and got a job with NBC television, giving tours of their studios. I would wear like a silly uniform and, take guests around their studios. And it was there that I came across my first job in television, which was working for like a talk show, like a reality talk show, not a reality TV show, but a talk show. And sometimes you kind of your career goes, you follow it instead of leading it. And I was going where the jobs were. And eventually I worked my way up to become a producer of documentary style news for NBC, and realized that I had a knack for it. Because you asked me earlier to be a producer and a director. A lot of people know what a director does. They direct the film. The producer is a really important job. They have to pre-interview who you're going to talk to and make sure that you can bring a camera where you're going and make sure that you have all of the elements you need technically to shoot and make the film. And it was really good training being a producer in news for documentary. So I think that's how it came about.
All of the themes addressed in your films and documentaries are very different from each other. Is there a common thread that ties them all together?
I think my first film, The Linguists, and this current film, The Anthropologist, they're probably the closest tied together. They involve the loss of culture and the science that sort of studies to preserve culture, to understand the changes and adapting, climate and how people will survive. So I think that those two films very closely align. The other films I've done have just been about, other topics, but we're always creating a film that we think will be entertaining. Because when people watch a movie, whether it's a documentary or a movie in the theaters, they really want to be entertained. And so you have to tell them the important information you're trying to convey in a way that sort of entertains them. And that, I would say, is probably the recurring theme. All of our films use kind of the mechanisms of movies in order to make it feel like you're in a theater watching a movie.
And how do you find the main topics for your work, or do they find you?
Yeah, sometimes they find us. My first film, The Linguist, which I've mentioned to you in this interview, was funded by the National Science Foundation. That's America's central government-run foundation that helps make grants for science projects, films about science. And my film, The Linguist, was the first film funded by the National Science Foundation to go to the Sundance Film Festival. And as a result, we had meetings with them again years later to do another film, and that's what The Anthropologist became, funded by the same group.
Okay, and finally, if it's possible, could you give us a glimpse to what your projects might be in the future?
Sure. So there's two short films that my partners Dan and Seth and I are working on right now. One is called Detected, and it's about an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley who's creating a brassiere that detects breast cancer. And it's in clinical trials now, the bra is. So the film follows the trajectory of coming up with the idea of the innovation all the way to making it a real medical product. So that's one.
And when is it premiere?
Well, right now it's the end of post-production, so we're almost done, finished editing it. So probably in like a year or so.
Well, that's all.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming here and let us ask you some questions about the film. And it was really nice meeting you.
Nice to meet you. Good luck in your spelling bees.